Oakland, California, 1951. A peaceful afternoon over a blue-collar neighborhood. Two kids playing in a homey park, their giggles threading the streets with that pure happiness only children can bring. And then, poof, she was gone. No cry, no fight, no alert. Poof, as if the air itself had swallowed her. Neighbors spilled onto the streets. Police searched the waterfront, all the alleys, every darkened corner. But nothing. No child. No child. No child. No child. No. Just silence and questions that hung heavy, unsolved. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and decades passed by until 70 years later, the truth started to come out. The tale begins the summer prior, in 1950. A young woman stepped from a train into California, 6 children following behind her, and an uncertain future weighing upon her shoulders. She was Antonia Albino. She had departed from Puerto Rico, a land which had given her little more than hardship. Hopefully the United States would be different. She arrived penniless, she arrived uncomfortable, but she arrived with something much greater: determination and grit. She had faith that if she just worked hard enough, perhaps her children could live the life she never did. They landed in West Oakland, a neighborhood that had prospered during war but was begiget during war, but was begiget prospered during war, but was begiget like Uwerts was begiget during it was a contradictory place. Freight trains roared through the neighborhoods, oil fumes clung to the air, and sailors flowed out of the bars after nightfall. Outside, Oakland may have appeared teeming and vibrant. Inside, it was a struggle, and survival required resilience. Antonia settled her family in a tiny house on Brush Street, crowded, noisy, and freezing cold in winter, but it was home. Every dollar stretched to the limit: food, clothing. During the day, she worked picking fruit, hands blistered and raw. At night, she sewed gloves by the faint light of a lamp, eyes blazing from fatigue. Exhausted as she was, she never gave up. She had to keep moving. She was parent and parent both, the rock in her children's lives. Her youngest, Luis, born about 1945, was 6 in 1951. Wide-eyed and curiosity-driven, he still perceived the world as a place of Inchan. He still perceived the world as a place of Inchan, Shan bliss, Inchan, Ashan Yuralabrok. The prayer lilt is Asir, he calls the slills, Ingleses, and danger hadn't yet mastered the art of hiding behind a friendly face. Neighbors recalled him as sweet, innocent, and little, someone who could still find magic in the smallest things, even in a city's hardest edges. Louise's best friend was his older brother, Roger. Roger was 10 and already burdened with responsibilities most grown-ups would avoid. While Louise was carefree, Roger was prudent. He interpreted for their mother, managed the younger children, and stood guard over them all. Louise loved him. He trailed behind Roger, participated in his games, struggled to keep pace with his deliberate step, and trusted him entirely. Their house was alive, 6 children in small space. Arguments, laughter, clinking plates, the thud of small feet. It wasn't quiet, but it was saturated with love. She ironed their ill-fitting clothes, got them to church on Sundays, showed them how to pray, to be tough, to never give up hope. And yet behind her toughness, anxiety always lurked. Antonia understood the world was not always kind. She cautioned again and again, don't go too far away. Don't trust too soon. Her hands gripped the rosary tighter whenever there was bad news filtering through the neighborhood. And when she cautioned them, her tone had an authority beyond their years, something her children sensed even if they were not able to verbalize it. Safety was never guaranteed. West Oakland in the early 50s was constantly in motion. Shipyards had attracted thousands of families during the war, families from the American South, from Latin America, from the Caribbean. Cultures mixed, sometimes fought. Gospel music flowed from churches, Spanish resonated in the streets. Life was vibrant, though tension also hung over every neighborhood like Brush Street. Schools were understaffed, roads were cracked, lights flickered and died, and the police, when they came at all, did not always provide reassurance. For Roger and Louise, the little sanctuary was Jefferson Square Park, a plain sort of place, swings, a slide, and spots of worn grass. Freedom, 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 freedoms, us freedom, what us freedom, spots of worn grass. Freedom, freedom, ultims, freedom, us freedom. Here, in Jefferson Square Park, the boys might laugh without worrying, run without fear, and forget, if only for a short time, how big and light their world might feel. Roger stayed close to Louise on those afternoons, not because someone had told him to, but because he just knew it was his job, the unofficial obligation older siblings tend to bear. Even during times of happiness, the fissures in their universe were apparent. One miscalculation, one brief opportunity, and everything would shift. Antonia was aware of it. She didn't always speak it, but it stayed in her eyes as the children departed the home, in the silent prayers she offered at bedtime, and in the unyielding square of her shoulders as she worked despite fatigue. By February 1951, the Albino family had fallen into a precarious rhythm. Life wasn't simple, but it was stable. Antoni of some just simple, but it was stable. Anton. The children attended school, and in the afternoons they sped to the park, pursuing the sort of happiness children alone know. Louise was yet young enough to trust the world, to think that it was good. Roger was barely old enough to sense the burden of responsibility, and Antonia, as ever, kept them all on track. No one could have anticipated how soon that equilibrium would be broken, how a wide-eyed boy could disappear in an instant, how a family that had come to Oakland in pursuit of hope would instead bear a grief so profound it would reverberate for more than 70 years. February 21st, 1951. The afternoon was warningless. The sky was low, gray clouds hanging heavy. The winter cold caused every child's breath to show like a mist as they ran laughing and playing in their own world. Roger and Louise played at Jefferson Square Park as always. Roger, 10 years of Square Park as always. Roger, 10 years to them, the swings, the dirt paths, the old slide, it was more than a park. It was their entire world. Then, suddenly, all changed. Roger sensed it first, a swift sinking feeling of certainty that something was amiss. Louise was no longer at his side. Panic hit him, swift and jagged. He ran, pounding heart, down the street, past houses, gasping. Each step held an urgency. He rushed into their full house, words spilling out in a combination of Spanish and English, frantic and muddled. Louise, there was a woman. She spoke to him. She took him. Antonia stood still. Her figure became stiff, eyes wide with fear. A neighbor bent forward, struggling to hear. Antonia grasped her apron, shaking as she implored Roger to say it again. He did, talking fast, trembling hands. A woman. She had spoken to Louise. She. And then he was never seen again. Chairs scraped against the floor, coats were snatched up, and Antonia sprinted out into the night with neighbors following closely behind. Roger, still wheezing, took the lead. This way. She took him this way. His face was white, his eyes heavy with a burden no child should ever have to bear, the dawning sick realization of what this might be. They arrived at the park. Roger pointed to the swings, the slide, the exact rings, the exact. The park was silent, unnaturally still. The swings swayed back and forth in the wind, creaking softly, as if a child had just released his hands. The metal slide shone in the dim light, but Louise was nowhere to be seen. Antonia's voice broke as she screamed his name, Spanish cries ringing down the street. Neighbors spilled out of buildings, sprinting through backyards, side alleys, and into the railroad tracks. Roger yelled too, panicked, doing everything he'd do, panicked, doing everything he stopped the trass. Word traveled quickly down Brush Street. A boy was missing. A woman had kidnapped him. What started as stifled murmurs quickly became a panic that swept through the neighborhood. The police were no sooner there than the street was a knot of worried faces and escalating voices. Antonia clung to a neighbor, fighting to describe what had occurred. Roger, shaking, stood before the officers, compelled to recreate every detail. His account came out in disjointed bits. A woman, maybe around her 30s, a scarf over her hair. She was Spanish-speaking. She was giving away candy. Louise had tailed the stranger. Roger came home running, panting, and frightened. The officers heard him, but their expressions were skeptical. They asked him for more information. What was she like? In what direction did she head? Are you certain? Roger's voice shook. He attempted to, but he was only 10. Sheer terror impaired his memory. The words lodged, and gradually their trust started to unravel. They began to interrogate him. Perhaps there had not been a woman. Perhaps Louise had merely strayed. The bay was not far. It happened. It was preferable to accepting something much worse. The official narrative congealed in a matter of moments. Louise had fallen into the bay. The Coast Guard and the Past Guard had keeled. Boats searched the waters off Jack London Square. Searchlights bisected the fog. Divers leaped into the dirty water. Nets swept the shoreline. They searched for days, but nothing came up. No child, no clothing, no sign. Antonia didn't buy it. She had heard Roger's words. She had seen the terror etched on his tiny face. She believed him. She was certain her son had not strayed. Louise was the one who had been abducted. Yet every time she attempted to outcry, her voice faltered to break through the wall of language. Spanish flowed from her in crashing, raw tides. She implored, she pleaded, insisting they comprehend, but before her words could be translated, much of the passion was gone. The desperation did not pay off. To the police, the case went cold. But to the Albino family, the horror was just starting. At home, there was laughter no more. The vacant chair, chair no more. The vacant chair, chair. The vacant chair, chair meant wolves willful to be. And a chair, vacant chair, and you meant slack at hand. To the vacant chair, to stay, to Antonia would stand at the door some nights, looking down the street as if her boy was going to run back at any moment. The other children were less talkative. Their games lost their spark by a sorrow they were not yet able to articulate. And Roger. Roger bore the heaviest burden. He had witnessed. He had run. He had done what he believed to be right. And when they came back, Louise was missing. That one split-second choice, the one that had come so near, so now, that had come so non, that done so lean, flip back. He replayed it endlessly. He should have remained, yelled more loudly, taken Louise's hand, and never let go. The guilt weighed heavy, slow, and deep. Louise had not vanished from the park. His disappearance rang through all the nooks and crannies of their existence, the meals eaten in silence, the muttered prayers, the furtive looks toward the park that no one ever mentioned. A small boy was missing. A mother had lost her son. A brother had lost his best friend. A brother had lost his best friend. And a family was engulfed in a long, sorrowful quiet that would extend for more than 7 decades. The subsequent days merged into fatigue and terror. Brush Street was silent with children's laughter. Even shouting and screams sounded muffled, as if nobody felt safe disturbing the quietness left by the departure of Louise. Antonia didn't rest. She couldn't. Each morning, while the bay still lay shrouded in fog, one thought consumed her: find Louise's ears, Louise, our slua. Her body ached from long days in the orchards and nights spent sewing gloves. But that pain didn't matter. Not now, not when her child was missing. She returned to the police station repeatedly, sometimes with Roger, sometimes with another boy, sometimes with a neighbor who might be able to assist with translation. Spanish spouted from her mouth in streaming waves of urgency, of pleading. My son was taken. He didn't drown. Please find him. The officers, who were already doubting, gave only courteous headshakes. They reminded her the bay had already been searched. These things did happen. Short of new evidence, there was nothing they could do. Every time she left the station, her footsteps slowed, her shoulders dipping a little lower, yet she never quit. Initially, she went daily, then weekly, then monthly. And as the years went by, her visits dwindled to once a year, every year on the Ann to once a year, every year on the Anbist, and Antlitzer the Sus, on the Ensley, on Anblet to once a year, every year on the Ann Riddles, on the last. The officers learned about her. The dark-eyed woman and frayed photo, a mother captured in time. They respected her determination, but they could not share her sense of urgency. To them, the file was closed. To Antonia, it was a silence she never knew. For Roger, the hurt would not heal. He had obeyed, rushed for aid, but it did not register with his heart. In his head, he had failed. He ought to have remained. He ought to have struggled more vigor. The guilt crept up, slow and incessant, and became a part of him. Roger became quieter in the months that ensued. The spark of his laughter was extinguished. At school, he stayed away from the park, stayed away from curious questions from friends. At home, he stood by the window, gazing at the street, as if expecting something or someone who would never come back. Each time his mother asked him to tell the police about that day, he did. Eventually, it stopped being a memory and began to feel like a confession. The other kids adapted as well. Some grew angry, frustrated that they were kept so in the dark and uncertain. Others closed down completely, refusing to use Louise's name in case it reopened the door. But regardless of how each of them reacted, the lack was always present. The vacant chair at meals, the unused candle on birthdays, the silent wish at Christmas that Antonia clung with a ferocity that stunned those about her. Neighbors observed her going back to the station year in and out, prayed in whispers with her rosary at night, watched her grow thinner and her gait slower, but never falter. She would not relinquish, for she believed deep within her heart that her son was still alive. She never lost hope, a neighbor would later attest. Even when others had lost faith, she held fast. Sorrow, however, was with the loveliness, was ours, always ours, and sorrowless, sorrow, same dwarf. Our lives sorrow, or for sorrow, is a word words, or the full sorrow. Even when others had lost faith, she held fast. Wrinkles carved deeply into Antonia's face spoke of toil, of yearning, and of heartbreak. Her hair went gray well before its time. Her frame grew old, formed not only by work, but by sorrow. She found comfort in faith. She prayed, relied on her church, but there was always a shadow in her eyes. A piece of her stuck on that day. Louise vanished. Years went by. Oakland evolved. Freeways cut West Oakland, separating ancient neighborhoods and dispersing from support east. Plants closed. Crime moved in. But for the Albino family, none of that much mattered. In their minds, they were still in 1951, still stuck on that February afternoon when Roger escaped, and everything was never the same again. Louise would have been a young man by the 1960s. Antonia's optimism increased. He'll return, she said to her children. He's out there somewhere. She envisioned him, perhaps in uniform, perhaps with callous hands, living somewhere distant, never forgetting, never looking for her. Those illusions sustained her when the police had long been silent. Roger, a grown man, bore his guilt in silence. He married, worked, raised a family, but he was said to be touched by sorrow that never really let go. He never talked of the park, of stories from childhood, and when Louise was mentioned, his tone shifted, heavy, laden with words that were too much to carry. He never forgave himself for fleeing that day. Life went on as it had always done. Bills had to be paid, children had to be raised, meals had to be prepared, and yet every happy moment bore a gap. Every wedding, every birth, every celebration bore a silent shadow. The awareness of birth celebration bore a silent shadow. The awareness of every sadness seemed more poignant because loss had wandered into their house much earlier. For Antonia, it wasn't death that was painful, it was the not knowing. A death was something that could be grieved, a grave could be tended to. Absence was not the same. Absence raised questions that never ended. She held on to Roger's tale, recited it as a truth she refused to let go. A woman kidnapped him. He's alive out there. Some people dismissed her. Sus alive, some people dismissed her. Some people dismissed her. Some people dismissed her. But surrendering to Antonia was like losing Louise all over again. On her deathbed, Antonia's children had come, burdened by the question that had been with her to death, "Where's Louise?" That question never died. It was transmitted from sibling to sibling, from generation to generation, breathed into the hearts of grandchildren. Louise's vanishing wasn't a thing. It was an echo that was shaping faith, shaping guilt, shaping memory. He wasn't merely a lost boy, he was the missing space at the dinner table, the ghost in every picture, the quiet that wouldn't abate. Outside, his case had been forgotten years ago, just another case stuck in some police station. But for the Albino family, February 21st, 1951 never became yesterday. It stayed today, an open wound, a silence no one could penetrate. By the mid-1960s, 15 years had lapsed since the day in the park. Outside, the world had moved on. Celebrities came and went. Wars were fought far away. But for the albinos, time stood still. Louise was 6 years old in their imaginations, still smiling in the same photo, still alive in the memories spoken in hushed tones late at night, and still, in spite of no answers, there was hope. In 1966, Louise would have been 21, the age at which all young men were required to register for the draft. It seemed to the family like a sign. If Louise lived, if he grew up with a different name, there would have been a record, a trail in the government's papers. Antonia and her kids chased that hope. They called, went to offices, sent letters. Roger, grown now, gave himself entirely over to the task, bearing not own. But the trail ended in a dead space. Louise's name was not in any system. The records were blank, reflective of the same silence that had hung over their lives for so long. For Antonia, the military search had seemed her last best hope. When it too turned out to be a disappointment, her determination was only strengthened, and yet she grew more isolated. She would not let the case drop. But with each year that went by, there were fewer who lee. The family returned their focus to Puerto Rico. Antonia still maintained her heart close to her heart, questioning if maybe Louise had been abducted there. They traveled more than once, from island to island across the Caribbean, holding in hand the same picture, Louise at 6, beaming. They went through towns, approaching strangers. "Has anyone seen this boy?" There were others who were exhausted from the asking. To the majority, the boy in the picture was a stranger. To the albinos, he was the world. Each journey ended the same way. They came back to Oakland with heavier hearts, and years kept mounting. Antonia aged. Her hair went white, her pace slowed, but her resolve remained unbroken. She continued to go to the missing persons office, now perhaps once a year, always holding the same photograph types once a year, always holding the same photograph tied judicially slipped Liel Spoder, Suli kind of desislik here. Always. The officers still had nothing new for her. Courteous nods, sympathetic smiles, but no information. Louise's file remained locked away in a cabinet, dust accumulating on it, untouched. Roger bore the burden in silence. Middle age caught up with him, carrying with him the memory of that day stuck in his chest like an object sharp that he couldn't possibly take out. He created a life, marriage, work, family, but the shame lingered. With every time the family searched anew or went back to Puerto Rico, it was all brought back. He had been the one to witness. He had fled. And when he came back, it had already come too late. That moment could never be undone. The other brothers and sisters bore the loss differently. Some refused to mention Louise's name, afraid even a breath would reopen the wound. Others clung to his memory, bringing him up at family gatherings and making certain slexly and you bring slam slutsleys and berets le church lake sleys, birds syringy hens and angel soup, and bringing him up at family gatherings. But however it was born, tongue or silence, Louise was there. He was the absent piece during every holiday, the silhouette in every family photo. As for the city around them, it changed. The skyline of Oakland changed. Freeways sliced through established neighborhoods, dispersing longtime residents. Factories shut down. Jobs were gone. Crime increased. But to the Albino family, all of that was just background noise, so much less important than the void that their lives were still rooted in one stuck moment, the death of a boy who had been present one day and gone the next. By the 1980s and 1990s, hope was tenuous. DNA testing was just starting to show up in police investigations, but it was not yet available to average families. For the albinos, there was no obvious way ahead, only prayer. Antonia held on to that belief with all her might. Every evening she murmured Louise's slow. Every evening she murmured Louise's nay. He's alive, she said to her children. Somewhere, he's alive. Time, though, is unforgiving. In 2005, Antonia died, leaving over 5 decades of unresolved questions in her wake. Her own hope had never faded, but never been realized. Her children attended her funeral, bearing with them the question she had brought with her to the grave, where is Louise? Her death made the grief more profound. It felt conclusive. The woman who had clung to the light the longest had vanished, and the enigma persisted. Roger, already weighed down by years of remorse, now bore the burden of his brother's disappearance as well as his mother's death. By this time, Louise had been missing more than 5 decades. To the city, the police, the media, his case was old news, a closed book. But for the Albino family, the grief was still fresh. It defined everything. Their stories, they're there. Their stories, they're there, and everything, and stories, they're with their stuff or bore. Children grew up hearing about the missing uncle, the indomitable grandmother. They were left with more than just tales. They were left with the pain of a question they could not answer. The case may have been cold in the eyes of the Oakland Police Department, but in the Albino household, it was alive, burning quietly in the background of their lives. And then, in the 21st century, something changed. A tool emerged that neither Antonia nor Roger could have imagined. A tool powerful enough to pierce the silence that had surrounded them for nearly 75 years. For nearly 3/4 of a century, Luis Armando Albino's vanishing was both a mystery and an open wound. Antonia had died without resolution. Roger had grown old with guilt. The sisters had told and retold the tale so many times it had reached myth status, indelibly etched in memory but unresolved. To the majority, Louise was merely a name in a dusty old case file. To his family, he was a shadow that never departed. By the early 2000s, the trail had gone cold. No new leads, no suspects, no evidence to study, All they had was Roger's testimony, a woman with a scarf, a promise of candy, a boy hey hey, a boy hey, a hey hess, a boy hey hey. It was a memory many ridiculed, the type of remembrance skeptics refer to as unreliable, the type of story a distraught family holds on to for too long. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the silence was shattered. Luis's niece, Alita Alquin, decided in 2020 to get a DNA test. She wasn't considering the case. She wasn't searching for answers. She was interested out of curiosity. Millions of people had started using tools like Ancestry or 23andMe to investigate family origins, trace descent, and discover long-forgotten relationships. Alita wanted simply to learn more about her Puerto Rican heritage. That was all she expected. But when her results came, one of them jumped out, a name she didn't know, a man listed as a close relative. The system calculated a 22% DNA match, a relation typical of an uncle. She went cold. Their family had no unaccounted for uncles except one. The uncle whose name was murmured around family gatherings, whose photo had grown old, whose history had defined their family for so many generations. Luis. Alita's heart pounded as she gazed at the screen. The number, the name, the face on the DNA profile, it wasn't real, and yet somehow it was. Could it be? Almost 7 decades after, could a series of percentages and an algorithm on a computer tell her the unthinkable? Her initial reaction was to send him a message. She composed a thoughtful, polite note informing him who she was and why the match could be significant. She sent it and wait and wait. Each vibration of her phone gave her heart a jolt, but weeks went by. No response. Maybe he hadn't received the message. Perhaps he dismissed it as a scam? Or perhaps he was privy to something. Every day of silence eroded Alita's hope. It seemed like the past had held out an answer for her, only to take it back. She drew back at last. Life required attention, work, family, the day-to-day, but the idea never receded. It remained whispering whenever she glanced at her daughters. What if Luis is alive? What if he's out there all these years? By the beginning of 2024, the force of history weighed more heavily. She imagined Antonia, her grandmother, trekking to the police station year after year. She imagined Roger, tormented by remorse for nearly half a century. And she imagined her own daughters raised in an abuse of rapists, and a DNA could do the detectives of old age of justice that no longer existed. The tale had endured all these years. How could she let it die now? Then one day she watched a documentary about a family who had cracked a decades-long vanishing with DNA. Something clicked. We already have the match, she thought. We have the proof. Now it's up to us. Alita started looking once more. She searched online for pictures of the man associated with the DNA match. When she discovered them, her breath stopped. The resemblance was staggering, his jawline, his eyes, so similar to her uncle, so similar to Antonia. She excavated further. In the Oakland Public Library, she scrolled through reels of microfilm and discovered it, a 1951 newspaper clipping. 2 boys together, Roger and Luis. Looking at that picture alongside the current photograph of the man, the similarity was undeniable. Equipped with all she had amassed, DNA tests, pictures, decades of past, Alita entered the Oakland Police Department. More than 7 decades had passed since her grandmother had stood within the same corridors, begging in Spanish and too often ignored. Now her granddaughter came back, not with hope, but with proof. This time, the officers heard. They opened up the file again. The FBI and California Department of Justice were brought in. Abruptly, a case long forgotten was brought back to life. Federal authorities made their way east to interview the man. He was reluctant. Federal authorities made their way east to interview the man. He was reluctant. He had lived his entire life thinking he was someone else, used by a couple he believed were his parents. He was a retired firefighter, a Marine Corps veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, and many honors. A husband, a father, a grandfather. His life had been spent serving and sacrificing. The possibility that he could be the missing Oakland child of 1951 was unbelievable. But when the agents presented him with the photos, the DNA result, and the tale, he consented to a test, and the result was unambiguous. The man was Luis Armando Albino. For the Albino family, the news fell like lightning. After 73 years, the unthinkable had occurred. The little boy they had lost, the son Antonia had pleaded with the police to bring back. The brother Roger never ceased mourning, was alive. But joy was mixed, but joy was mixed, was mixed, the joy was mixed spirit to alive, but joy was mixed. Luis had not been raised with his family. He had been brought up by others, never knowing the reality of who he was. He had lived a life constructed on a fiction he didn't know. He had fought for his country, risked his life in combat, rescued lives as a firefighter. He had been married, raised children, received grandchildren, but he had done it all without knowing his own history. His recollections of childhood were patchwork, bits and pieces, brief glimpses of travel, unknown faces, but nothing concrete. When he inquired as a child, he was told to be silent. He had accepted the silence, never guessing it was concealing so much. For his brothers and sisters, finding out was almost too much. Joy because he was alive. Sadness because Antonia had died in 2005, not knowing her prayers had been answered. Roger, an old man, shook with the realization. He had harbored that day for 73 years. Now he had evidence at last. He had not imagined it. Was it a crime of need, a moment of opportunity, or something worse, a black market kidnapping, as some speculated? Did the family that adopted Luis know he had been kidnapped, or were they deceived too? The answers disappeared into time. The park woman was likely gone. His adoptive parents had died. There was no paper trail to follow, no witnesses, only the faded memories and silent blanks. Perhaps the complete truth would never be revealed. But one truth was more important than all the others. Luis had lived. When the FBI broke the news in June 2024, Luis Albino's story was forever changed. It was no longer a tale of loss. It became a tale of survival, of determination, of science-shattering decades of silence. A DNA test taken for curiosity's sake had done what centuries of detectives could not. For Alida, it was everything. She grew up with the tale of her missing uncle, a myth, a mystery, a quiet grief handed down through generations of her family. Now she had brought him home. Her first words to him were plain, soft, but weighed down with years. "Thank you for letting us find you." It wasn't the end. It was the start of its last chapter. Luis would soon go to California to confront the family he never knew, the brother who had borne guilt across a lifetime of On a balmy June day in 2024, an old man walked off an airplane in California. He had only an overnight bag with him. His gait was steady, though time had bent his back and lost some of his spring. His eyes looked around the terminal, both confused and probing. He was homecoming and walking into the unknown. He was Luis Armando Albino. 3/4 of a century ago, he had disappeared from an Oakland park, carried off by a. He had gone out as a 6-year-old boy. Now, at 80, he came back not as the frozen child in memory, but as a grandfather, a war veteran, a retired firefighter, a survivor of life stolen without warning. Standing with them was Alida, the niece who had refused to let the story diminish. When their gazes collided, her chest constricted. She had pictured this moment for months, wondering what she would say. But when she moved closer, all she could do was whisper, "Thank you for allowing us to locate you." Luis's expression softened. He reached out to her, his worn hand roughened by labor and age, and drew her into a silent hug. No, he ceases. Surrounding them, the family cried openly. Strangers at the terminal stopped, feeling something out of the ordinary transpiring, a man coming home not only to a location, but to a past long believed lost. But the most profound moment was yet to come. In a small house in Oakland, Roger, now 83, waited. Frail but awake, he hadn't seen his brother since the age of 10. For 73 years, he'd lived with that moment, the day he returned, the day he realized in posteritanes, in earnest resistance, that Rawlings of drilling for two is Eureka. That moment had conditioned his whole life. Roger attempted to stand when Luis entered the room. Roger's hands trembled. His voice broke on the initial word, Louise. They locked eyes. There was silence for a brief moment. Then they both moved toward one another and hugged tightly. It was more than a hug. It was time curling back on itself. Memory, loss, and guilt, and love, and healing all coiled into the same moment. Roger cried into the shoulder, cried into the shoulder. Luis embraced him, one hand stroking the back of his brother's head, an action born of something more than memory. They hugged. Alita would tell the story later, and it wasn't just a hug. It was everything. The two brothers sat for hours, side by side, whispering. They reminisced in shreds of childhood, memories fuzzy with time. Roger finally spoke of the guilt he had held for so long, the agony that had defined him. Louis shook his head. You did what you could. For Roger, those words removed a burden that had been altogether too weighty to bear. For the first time in his existence, he felt that it wasn't his fault. The reunion did not end with the brothers. Luis reunited with his sisters, who had yearned for him their entire lives. He reunited with nieces and nephews, who had grown up listening to his tale. He reunited with great-nieces and great-nephews who now realized that family lore was more than stories of the past. It was real. They informed him about Antonia, her daily appearances at the police station, her nightly prayers in silence, her rock-solid belief. When they told him she had died in 2005, Luis bowed his head, tears running down his face. She never gave up searching, he said in a whisper, and I never knew. Someone gave it to him, the crumpled old newspaper clipping, the picture of two boys published the day he disappeared. Luis and Roger pictured side by side. He looked at it for a very long time. It was him, but it wasn't. A past version of himself lost in history. That was me, he breathed. That was me all along. The reunion was happy, but with the taste of sorrow. Roger's health was weak, and only 2 months after that long a wait. But those who knew him felt that he left this world in peace, which he had never felt before. I think he died happy, Alita said. For 73 years, he carried guilt. In the end, he got to see the truth. He held his brother again. He got to let go. Luis also felt the sting of that loss. He had only discovered his brother to lose him again. But their time together, no matter how short, brought healing. The hug, the talks, the fiffer, the five, the hug, the talks, the fur, the right healing. The hug, the talks, the fees, the fur, the tas, the fur, surf the foot, rod. And libelous of all the fur. For the Albino family, this reunion was bigger than the individual. It was a tale of history restored, a testament that memory shared from generation to generation can survive even silence. It showed that technology could awaken what had been buried apparently forever, and that hope, even after years, could yet find its way back home. Neighbors wept. Reporters wrote the tale. 73 years, one writer noted, is longer than most lifetimes. And yet love, memory, and science conspired to give this family the ending they were denied. It was difficult for Luis to accept the truth. He lived 8 decades of one life. Then everything changed. The so-called parents whom he thought were his were not. The siblings whom he thought never existed, existed and awaited him. The childhood that he might have had, the birthday celebrations, the milestones, the house Antonia had constructed, those were lost. And still Luis did not linger on what was lost. "I lived a good life," he said to them. "I served my country. I raised children. I have grandchildren. Yes, something was taken from me. But I gained too. I can't change the past, but I can be grateful for the present." But in his eyes lingered the half-vanished trace of a boy who had once walked with his brothers hand in hand through a neighborhood park, who had trusted too readily and walked behind a stranger for the mere promise of sweets. The reunion in June of 2024 did not wipe away what had occurred in 1951. It could not resolve all questions or reverse decades of heartache. But it put an end to a circle. The Albino family, after 73 years, finally received what they never received, a living answer. And in that answer was vindication. Roger had told the truth. Antonia's trust had not been in vain. The tale of Luis Albino was no longer one of vanishing. It was now a tale of return. Summer 2024 provided the Albino family with something very few in their circumstances ever get: a miracle. Luis was alive. He had lived life to the full, raised children, and now stood before the family that had never lost hope. But under the happiness, another reality persisted. The offense had never been resolved. Louise had returned home, but the questions conceived in Jefferson Square Park that frigid February afternoon still had no answers. Roger had not forgotten her, the woman in her 30s who spoke Spanish, a green scarf wrapped over her hair. She had appeared to them peacefully smiling, as if she belonged there. She had offered Louise candy and then abducted him. "If you wish, I can now compile all the chunks we've rewritten and sew them together in a single fully polished, YouTube-ready long-form script, complete with smooth flow, suspense pacing, and emotional highlights, so it's recording ready." Then she was gone with him. That memory haunted Roger for 73 years. But as soon as the does, no drawing of a sketch, no search door to door, no warnings issued. Rather, investigators concentrated only on the hypothesis that Luis drowned, with resources expended in searching the bay. For years, any true trail had disappeared. Now, thanks to Luis being alive, Roger's memory was finally justified. He hadn't dreamed up the woman. He hadn't misread what occurred. But vindication had arrived without identification. Who was she? Had she known the Albino clan, or was she a stranger? Did she act alone, or as a part of something larger? Even if her name is lost forever, one question still burns: why Louise? Some believe it was random, a desperate act by a woman longing for a child, or simply reckless. Others suspect something more organized. In mid-20th century America, black market adoptions weren't unheard of. Families like the Albinos, immigrant, poor, with limited access to legal protection, were especially vulnerable. Was Louise taken as part of one of those networks? Was she paid? Did he travel straight to the couple that adopted him, or change hands several times before finding his new identity? The details are still unclear, the truth long since lost, dispelled by time. Luis fondly remembered his adoptive parents. They had cared for him, provided him with a childhood full of love. He borrowed their name, attended school, matured as a man believing their tale. To them, they were his family, but whenever he would question his childhood, their responses were evasive, apologetic, always unfinished. Something was always lacking. Did they realize what really happened? Were they informed he had been abandoned or orphaned? Or had they closed their eyes, reassured by the tale that they just sailed, they closed your eyes, reassured by the tale that they're eating on the they, if they're that eat slice. They died before Luis could ever discover who he was. And that raises another painful question, not of the kidnapper, but of those who ought to have defended the family. Why had the Oakland police so readily disbelieved Roger? Why hold on to the theory of drowning even with no body, no witnesses, no physical evidence? For the albinos, too, the response had been excruciatingly obvious. Antonia was a single mother from Puerto Rico with Pew Aretho, with Pew is a Reese, to her cries. Antonia was a single mother from Puerto Rico with Pew is a Puerto Rico, with Pew is a Echem. With pretty because of Flabica with a P, Roger was a kid. Their words were not being heeded. Their anxiety was perceived as overblown. They were not believable to the system, and because of it, the system didn't react. If only the police had canvassed the block, taken down leads, traced Roger's narrative, could Luis have been located before he was led too far astray? That question is more heavy than most. The 2024 reunion healed the Albino family deeply, but not Casey. They can now affirm with absolute conviction that Luis did live, that he was discovered, that Antonia was correct. They can't affirm who abducted him, why, or precisely how they did it. Those truths could be lost forever. Luis has embraced that reality with serene fortitude. I can't alter what occurred, he said to his family. I can only live with what I have. His words brought peace, reassurance, and acceptance in the midst of uncertainty. But for Alida and the next generation, the unanswered questions are infuriating. The FBI has technically left the case open, but after all these years, few expect new solutions. Too many voices gone. Too many records lost. Too many memories faded. Officially, Luis Albino's kidnapping is still unsolved. Thus, the Albino family continues, grateful but unfinished. They live with joy because the boy they mourned was found. They live with grief because the lead to knowing grew cold before ever having a chance to warm up. Uncertainty still persists in the dark places of this tale. Who was the woman in the park? Why Louise? Did the adoptive parents know what was going on? Was it possible to do anything to prevent it? Some things may never be known, but just as they existed for decades with vacancy, the Albino family has now learned to exist with secrecy. 73 years of silence altered by a single DNA test. What did you think occurred in Oakland that day back in 1951? Was it chance, or was it a part of something bigger? Let us know in the comments. And if you like stories like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss what's revealed next.